This begins CD number 6.
The rights are about taqwa. That is why that surah begins by focusing on this idea of being conscientious about your relationship with Allah and with His creation. So the huquq within marriage, right, is when you enter into marriage in Islam, marriage is not like in Christianity. Traditionally, it was actually considered to be a religious, it was actually considered to be one of the sacraments. In Islam, it's a contractual agreement at the primary level. It's a contractual agreement. And the thing about entering into a contractual agreement is the agreement will tell you what's expected of you as a partner and what's expected of the other party. That's the nature of a contractual agreement, is one party is expected to do something, the other party is expected to do something, and then they share in the benefits of the contractual agreement. But if one party breaks their side of the contract, then it's something. Or if both do it, you can have both. But if one does it, then the contract's breaking down. And that's why, when we get married, we're supposed to actually know what the contractual agreement is. And a lot of Muslims go into the relationship and they don't know what it is. They've just made a contract because they say in every marriage, right? What do we say? أَنْكَحْتُكَ عَلَى كِتَابِ اللَّهِ وَسُنَّةِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. I'm marrying you with the book of Allah and the Sunnah. Well, what does that mean if you don't know what it means? And that's what happens. They say, okay, because they're just thinking about getting married, but they're not thinking about what they were doing when they were getting married, which is they were going into a contractual agreement that's based on rules and regulations. And where do they come from? Kitab Allah wa Sunnat al-Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if you didn't do that when you got married, and then you start getting all these problems, it's not working out. Well, it's broke down at the contractual level. I mean, there might be other reasons, but more often than not, they're actually related to one side not agreeing to the contract, and more often than not, the other side that's being oppressed in it doesn't know what the contract was in the first place, so they don't even know that they're getting stinted in the relationship. And then it just goes from one disaster to another. And then what will happen, because human beings are so adept at entering into dysfunctional relationships that begin with your families. And we learn how to do it with our siblings. We learn how to, siblings get it. You can see it with your children. They learn very quickly how to rile the other one up. They know exactly what to say, and they know the reaction they're going to get. And they'll do it with that little smirk on their face. And they derive pleasure out of it, right? This is what happens. And you have to teach them and do these things to try to get them out. That's infantile behavior. Well, unfortunately, the infantile behavior often is never outgrown. And so what happens is the husband and the wife will learn quickly what pushes the buttons of the other. And that's a whole other class, right, of why people do that stuff. But there are reasons why they do it. There really are. And the worst ones are when it's a cycle of violence, because those become very, very strange. And there's a lot of really, if you study the literature on those things, it's very, very strange stuff goes on in domestic violence. And police who deal with domestic violence will tell you the most unbelievable stories about trying to save somebody in one of those relationships, because they're ill, they're really unwell. The people are very unhealthy, and they often don't know how unhealthy they are, and they can't get out of the relationships, and they don't want to at the conscious level. Nobody wants that relationship in reality. The soul doesn't want it. But unfortunately, the nature of the nafs is that it can get some very, very sick satisfaction out of these type of relationships. So when you enter into the contractual agreement, you should know what it is. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that the men have rights and the women have rights. The rights of the husband, which I'm going to deal with first, because they're not that many. They're really not, in relation to what the women get. And the problem is, if you haven't gone through this before, is that this week the women the men are going to all demand these rights, and then the women are going to they won't know that there's a whole other group that go for them. The maintenance, right, is a responsibility of men upon women. Qawama is on men. الرجال قوامون على النساء. And there's a number of reasons for that. They're mostly related to children, to raising children, because of the fact that a child basically needs about 12 years before it's on its own, unlike other creatures. I mean, most creatures quickly move into independence in the world. Children don't move into independence. It takes them a long time to become independent. And for the first few years, they're almost completely at the mercy of their caregivers. So men have to afford women the ability to maintain their children, and that's why women are the maintainers of children. So it's an order that in some ways is being rejected now, but it's rooted in a traditional understanding of what is best for all parties concerned. And because we believe it's from God, we're committed to it. There's people that can argue, I don't believe that or not, but we actually believe it's committed to God and that it's from God, and that much of what is happening now in America, the trouble that they have, the fact that they've got children going into schools and shooting children. I mean, you can say, well, it doesn't happen that often. Well, my God. I mean, just the fact that it's happening should be enough for major concern, because I think it's a testimony to our humanity that more of these type things aren't happening, given the type of situations that people are living in all over the world. I mean, if you look, the Europeans have no room, or the Americans have no room to point a finger at the Muslims about violence, because this is one of the most violent societies on the planet. If you look at the number of murders, if you look at the number of violent crimes of rape, and on and on. And if you just look at wars, 180 million people were killed in the 20th century in Western wars. 180 million. That is violent. So I believe that a lot of it has to do with dysfunctional households and the fact that children aren't being nurtured properly. That's important. Now, the two qualities about this religion, what are the two distinguishing characteristics of Islam? The two attributes. One of them, the Prophet ﷺ said, defined his religion. Mercy is one of them. He actually said every religion has a quality, in al-haya. So if you look at the idea of rahmah and haya, the beauty of this is that Allah is ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and you will get His rahmah if you have haya from Allah. See, if you have shame in doing anything that would displease your Lord, that's the best way of having the compassion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on you. Because then, even if you do wrong actions, you'll do them in secret. So He'll forgive you when you say astaghfirullah. But it's when you lose that shame, that modesty before Allah. See, not before creation. You lose it before Allah in secret. But once you lose it before His creation, what you do is you encourage other of His servants. So not only is your own soul corrupted, you have become now a corrupter of others. And that's why it's so terrible to do wrong actions publicly. All these type things that people do out there and encourage other people to do them. It's insidious. So, if you look at these two qualities, these qualities are natural to women and they're acquired in men. You see, women by nature have rahmah and by nature have haya, with rare exception. And they're forced to lose it. Like in this culture, it's seen as a disease. If you're shy, or if you're modest, it's seen now as something's wrong with you. So the beauty of the house is where this is meant to be nurtured in the children. This idea of that's what the mother's teaching the children. They have to be merciful to each other with animals. They pull the cat's tail and start pulling. You have to teach them. That's a sentient creature. And you take their hair and pull it around. And how do you like that? That's a creature. And my grandfather taught his grandchildren how to ride horses. And I remember this lesson. I was a young boy. He took a pencil or a stick or something and he put it in my mouth. And he yanked back really hard. And he said, never forget, that's what the horse feels when you're pulling that bit back. And I didn't forget that. That was a lesson, but that's a harsh way to teach mercy. But, the point is that we need to learn how to do that. Children need to learn how to be compassionate, and they can. And then you'll see children that have it by their nature. It's just good nature. They'll have it. Some children have it. But other ones, you'll see cruel children. And there's a relationship between what kids do, like children that are known to torture animals will often end up being very violent people when they grow up. We have lots of social science studies that deal with this thing. And there were kids, most of you who grew up in this culture will remember these kids that put lighter fuel on an animal or put a cat in a thing and put it, in a creek or something like that. I remember that one boy that did that in the area that I grew up. So you will have those type of children. Those children, they're getting that from somewhere, first of all. In rare occasion it's a bad seed, but usually it's something that it's learned behavior. But the point is that if they're gotten on time, you can save those people. They don't have to go that way. Women don't tend to have that, but they're getting it more and more. You see, you're having more women that are prone to violence and in this culture now, because these qualities are not being inculcated anymore. So the first right, which is the most important one that a man has, is the right to sexual pleasure. And this is, there's people here that non-Muslims that will might find that unusual or something like that. But the idea here is that if a woman is not menstruating, she should not refuse her husband if he desires to have relations. There's a number of reasons for that. And it comes from a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said if a man calls her wife to his bed and she refuses, then the angels supplicate against her. That's a hadith, and it's related in al-Bukhari. Ibn Hajar, in his commentary on that, he says that while a woman is obliged to avail herself sexually, that a man should also take into consideration her state. So it shouldn't be an abusive type. Because again, in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِلْرِجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةً, men have a degree over women. Ibn Abbas, who's the Tarjuman al-Quran, he is the interpreter of the Quran, he said it was that they are willing to give up their right, if needs be, but they won't stint their woman of her rights, if needs be. But they So a man should have that largesse, that sometimes it's inappropriate, but generally that is a haqq. And there's reasons for that, because the arousal of men is easier than women. A man is much easier aroused. He's much more stimulated by visual stimulation than a woman. So there's those reasons. That there are men who can get themselves in trouble. And there is a hadith, and it's a sound hadith, and the Prophet ﷺ said there's no modesty in teaching the religion. He said that if one of you sees a woman when he's out and feels desire, then let him go to his wife, because she has what she has. And so that's a clear example of what this is about, that a man will have a shahwa, he'll have a desire that if he doesn't fulfill it, then it can actually cause him to do something. But there are people out there that have that problem. So that is a haqq of a man, and it should be fulfilled with that in mind, that it's his haqq, it's a right. Now, obviously, the Prophet ﷺ said, I detest that one of you should discipline his wife and then want to sleep with her in the evening. So there's an idea also that, that the relationship, and that's husn al-ishra, which is a shared right, that each party treats the other well, with dignity, with good words, without harshness and those things, because that's going to be more conducive to intimacy. So intimacy that becomes more of a perfunctory experience, where somebody is just, it's qada al-watar, it's just fulfilling his desire, then it goes into a very low relationship, and the women will suffer on that end. So when I get to that section, I'll talk a bit more about that. The next one is the right to discipline his children. That the husband has a right to discipline the children. The reason for that is because women tend to be more compassionate. And sometimes that can have a deleterious effect on the child. Now, I just want to say about that disciplining a child, one has to really be careful about that. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, all of you are shepherds, and every shepherd is responsible for his flock. And then he mentioned that a man is responsible for his family, and a woman for her children. So a shepherd is compassionate and merciful. A shepherd does not beat the animals. Right? A shepherd knows that it's very easy to get the sheep to do what it wants if it knows how to do what it's doing. So children generally, one has to be careful. And I'm going to get into that because I'm going to end this class with a section on the children, so I don't want to really go into that now. But I will say about this that before 7, there shouldn't be any physical discipline given to the child unless it's very slight, pinching or something like that to get their attention. But any beating is before 7. They don't have any taklif, and it's just not right to do that. And even after 7, I'll talk about that thing, because there should never be any actual physical beating of anybody in a domestic situation. Nobody should be the victim of violence in the house. Discipline is not violence. And even when the Prophet ﷺ talked about the darb, which is a striking, he said غير مبرح, which is a non-violent strike. All right, it's very clear. Mubarrah means you don't bruise or damage any tissue. Right? So you can't. A violent strike is going to damage tissue, and it's haram to do that. So, but I'll go into that. So that is a right. He has a right to discipline his children. And then the right to house her in his house. And that's important when a woman marries. She should know at what level the socioeconomic status of the man is. Because if he's poor, he's going to have a poor house. And when you marry, you're entering into a contractual agreement accepting that that's the situation. Now, obviously, if he lied and took you to a house that he said it was his house, and then you get married and he takes you to, a little one-bedroom place and tells you, welcome home, that's recourse to divorce. That's because there was ghish, he cheated you. But generally, when you enter into the relationship, you're entering into that. Now, a woman also, in the contractual agreement, she relocates with the husband. So if the husband is going to a new house, the woman is obliged by the contractual agreement to relocate with the man. Now, there are conditions in which that doesn't apply. If she didn't receive her dowry, she's not obliged to relocate. Because sometimes the dowry will not be given because he hasn't fulfilled his part of the contract. She doesn't have to fulfill hers in that case. So if the dowry hasn't been given. Another reason is that the husband is not trustworthy. In other words, he has shown in the past that he was violent or he did not fulfill his obligations. She does not have to move with him outside of an area where she has family and friends that support her and protect her. So that's her right if there's going to be any abuse. The third is that if the land that she's being asked to relocate is in any way dangerous to her, so if it was in an area that was not safe, if it was going from a Muslim country to a non-Muslim country. Things like that. She is not obliged to relocate. And then the fourth one is that if she was not capable of maintaining contact with her parents, she's not obliged to move, or her family. So she has to be able to see her family, to see her parents. If she can't do that, she's not obliged to go and relocate somewhere else. So if any of those conditions are not fulfilled, she has a right to refuse to travel with him. And that's based on la darara wa la dirar. There's no harm and there's no reciprocating harm, because that's a qaida in usul. It's a basic principle. You can't harm somebody. So if the woman was going to be harmed in the relocation in those ways, she is not obliged to relocate. Now, the fourth right is the right to have his house maintained. And there's khilaf about what exactly that means. It's called khidma batina, which is domestic service. There's a khilaf about that. In the Maliki madhab, she should not refuse to do the daily domestic chores. Now, obviously, if a woman is working and the man is working, then it's different. But this is for a woman who is in the home. She's not working. She's in the home. In those cases, she should maintain chores, which the fuqaha mentioned. It included bread making, which has to do with khubz, and sweeping, bed making, laundry, bringing water to the house if it's needed. Now that still applies, believe it or not, in a large part of the world. I mean, it's kind of odd to think about that, but large part of the world, that still applies. Now, there is in the Maliki madhab, if a woman is a sharifa, and I'll go into what connotes that. Well, it's basically the hadith we did about the four things. If she has one of those qualities, then her status is elevated, and she should be given domestic help if she asks for it. And when Fatima asked for domestic help, the Prophet ﷺ told her to do the dhikr. I mean, that's the Prophet ﷺ's daughter, and she's a model for women. And also because he didn't let her wear gold. Women can wear gold, but his daughter did not wear gold. She had a special status amongst the women, alayhi salam. So she's not responsible for anything that involves craftsmanship, like sewing, embroidery, milling flour, or work that is normally done for a wage. She doesn't have to do any of that. So she doesn't have to sew things. She doesn't have to, darn the socks or do those type things. If she wants to, then that's from her good will. There's a beautiful hadith of Asma, who was the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And she said, when Zubair married me, he had no wealth, nor any servant. In fact, nothing save a camel that carried water in his horse. I used to feed his horse, get water, pull up his bucket, and knead dough. Although I could not bake bread at the time, so some neighboring women of the Ansar used to bake my bread for me. And then she said, we were sincere women. She said, kunna mukhlisat. In other words, we were doing this for Allah. So she's indicating, after saying all that, we were doing this for Allah. Because that's really drudgery. I even used to carry on my head date seeds from a portion of the land the Messenger of Allah had allotted to him, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And that's in Sahih Bukhari. Now, the scholars of the Maliki school exclude a woman of high standing from the obligation of domestic chores. And if her husband can afford it, then he's obliged to hire domestic help. And so the Malikis interpreted the thing about Aisha radiallahu anhu, that Ali was not able to afford domestic help. But if he was, then he would have had to have done it. And the husband has no right to force a woman to work outside of the home or to do work that is usually associated with a craft or a profession, because it's wage work. Just, in noting this, the man should nonetheless help the wife in the house, even if he's working outside. And that was the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet used to do dishes. He sewed his own clothes. He sewed his sandals, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He kneaded bread. He did things in the house. So that's important to remember, that you're doing it. It's a sunnah. And I was with a friend of Sheikh Abdullah al-Qadi's in the Emirates, and this little boy came in and he started playing with him, and he was saying, he'd make animal sounds, and then he'd ask the little boy, what animal is that? And the boy would say, and he was playing with him. And then when the boy left, he finished, he said, the Prophet ﷺ, he used to play with children, and I love to make the intention of fulfilling that sunnah before I do that. So he was actually fulfilling a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in doing that. And that's why if you're in your house and you do that, and tahtasib 'inda Allah, that you just consider a reward with Allah, it's not a waste of time. Because there are people who say, it's a waste of time, or I don't have time. Well, what about her? I mean, her time's as precious as your time in the world. So the idea, and Aisha radiallahu anha, when she said, they asked him, how was the Prophet ﷺ in the house? She said, kana fi mihnati ahli. He was in the mihna of his family. And it's a beautiful word, because she didn't say kana fi khidmati ahlihi. She said kana fi mihnati ahlihi. And mihna, the word comes from that which is servile or degrading. And the Prophet ﷺ would never do anything servile or degrading. But the point I think that she was emphasizing was that chores that you people might consider to be maheen, to be low things, he didn't elevate himself above them. And the idea is that any halal work is not degrading. If it's halal, it's not degrading, even if it's what we would call a menial task. The fact that the best of creation did it, including carrying wood, milking a goat, he did all of those things. So anybody that does those things is not degraded by doing those things, by the mere fact that the best of Allah's creation, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, did those things. Qadi Abu Bakr said that the best things that a man can serve himself in are those things that relate to his own ibadah, like getting your own wudu water, those type things, preparing the ghusl. I mean, obviously in pre-modern times that was much, much more common in the world than it is now. But there are still a lot of places. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam rose in the night and he would go to the water skin, untie it, and get his own wudu water. Even though he had servants in the house. I mean, there were servants in the house. The Prophet ﷺ had servants. So the fact that he did that is a sign. That's in Sahih Muslim. So the next right is obedience concerning the fulfillments of rights upon her. So it's binding upon a woman to willingly obey the husband if he commands her to fulfill any right binding upon her. So when you see the verse about obeying your husband, it has to do with huquq. You see, if it's his haqq, and if it's not a haqq, then you don't have to do it. So it's important to understand that once you know what your rights are, then you know what the limits of because he has to be obedient in fulfilling his rights to you as well. And that's the important thing to know. It doesn't mean, there's this idea that a lot of Muslims have that she's just supposed to do whatever he says and be this slavish, obedient servant in the house. It's not true. She can refuse things that she doesn't have to do. She has every right to refuse to cook for his guests. Right? In Maliki madhab and in Shafi'i madhab, she doesn't have to cook, period. Right? So, and she can say, go cook for yourself. I'm not encouraging that, because there's a hadith, man khabbaba imra'atan ala zawjiha, falaysa minni. The one that ruins the relationship between a man and his wife isn't from me. So I don't want to encourage but I want people to realize that, that we have to honor the women and their rights, right? So the point is that when Allah says obedience, He's talking about the huquq. That's where the obedience is. So if you know what the rights are, then that's why if He says we're moving to this house, and it's within those 4, then she says, no, that's disobedience. Do you see? And now he has a haqq because she's nashiza. She's in a state of disobedience. Do you see? Because she's stinting on his right. So it's important to know when this works and when it doesn't work. But it doesn't mean that she's just in submission to this man. No. But in certain things, yes. So these are the huquq. So once you know that, so that is a haqq of the man. And among this, it includes beautification, right? So it's a right for a man that his wife takes care of herself. And vice versa. This is husn al-ishra. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu said that I like to adorn myself for my wife just as I like my wife to adorn herself for me. So it's a sunnah for a man as well. To, his breath and his fingernails and his cleanliness, all those things. It goes both ways, but this is a haqq of the man. Also, skin, like if she's doing things that are making her skin become coarse, her hands cracking, things like that. Or working out to where she's becoming hard and muscular. All right, because that's also something that a man has a right to say, I don't want you to, to get too strong. And she might be doing it to beat him up too. So, so he's got to watch out for himself. Also, anything that relates to a haqq of Allah, he has a right to command her to pray, to fast, to pay zakat, to guard herself from any najasa, from anything impure, from backbiting, improper dress. So any of those things, that's a haqq of the man if she's not dressed properly, because he's ra'i, he's responsible. And there's hadith about a man who is like a cuckold. I don't know how to pronounce that, but I don't want to say the other word, which is a cruder word. A man who goes and sells women. That the Prophet ﷺ said that a man that allows his wife to go out with her enticements is like that man. You see, because, part of the whole thing about the hijab, which a lot of women don't understand, is the idea of that there is a reality to the eye. There's a reality to, a man can actually have a sexual experience with a woman with the eye. So he can rape her with his eye. And that's something that a woman should be protected from, because it's not appropriate. So a man has a right to not want other men's eyes deriving pleasure from his wife. And that's obviously from the hadith, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَةُ. Save your souls and your families from a fire whose fuel is men and stone. If a man commands a woman to do anything that's prohibited by Allah, or she's not obliged to do, then she doesn't have to obey him. There's a hadith in which a woman from the Ansar, she had a lot of her hair fell out, and her husband wanted her to put extensions onto her hair. And she went to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, don't do it. So here's a man who wanted, because sometimes after childbirth, a woman can lose a lot of hair because of the decrease in hormones. And there's times when women will lose hair. If their husband's stressing them out, they'll lose hair. So the idea was that he wanted her to add extensions, and the Prophet ﷺ told her not to. So she went to find out what her haqq is here. And when she found out she didn't have to do it, she shouldn't do it, she didn't do it. A man also has the right that a woman asks her husband for permission for nafila. And this relates to nafila that are going to affect his huquq, his rights, like fasting, extra fasts. So she'll get the reward of the intention if she wants to fast and she can't fast because he doesn't want her to fast. But he does have a right to say, I don't want you to fast for that reason. Also extra pilgrimages, things like that. And that's a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, which is related by Abu Dawood, the Prophet ﷺ said, a woman may not fast when her husband is at home without his permission. So when he's at home, if he's on a trip, then she can fast because it's not affecting his huquq. Nor should she permit into her house when he is at home anyone that he dislikes. So if he doesn't want somebody over, then that's a haqq. So. Also, the right of a man to his wife's chastity and virtue. what this means is that it's a right for a man that his wife guards her chastity and honor, which is called her honor. That she should not do anything that will tarnish her good name or his good name socially, that results in any type of shame coming back. So there are many reasons why the Sharia has prohibited things, because they're preventative. They're in order that things don't come about. So the reason for this, the Sharia has prohibited women from adorning themselves for ajanib, for males that aren't directly related to them. It's haram for her to do that. And that's the reason, is because these are enticements and she shouldn't do it, which is really important. So she should not wear anything that will outline her shape, and also wearing strong scents, walking seductively, mumilat, ma'ilat. The Jahili women used to, when they'd pass by men, they would stop and shake their bangles on their ankles as a way of attracting their attention to look at them. So anything that will attract the attention of men, she should not do. And then also speaking in hushed tones or in seductive ways. So if a woman speaks to a man, she should speak to a man forcefully. I mean, not violently, but just she shouldn't speak in a low, hushed tone, because for a man, that is an enticement. And if somebody has lust in his heart, which is what the Quran says, that the one who has في قلبه مرض فيطمع الذي في قلبه مرض, the one who has lust in his heart, which is one of the diseases of the heart. Lust is not a disease, but desiring illicit relationships is the disease. So if somebody has that type of disease where they would desire an illicit relationship, then speaking in that tone would, in a sense, be like a... And some women don't do that intentionally, but it's out of their modesty. So, but the modesty from the Sharia is to raise the voice, not to lower the voice. And the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said there's two types of women, two types of people from the fire that I haven't seen. One of them were the people that beat other people with sticks. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he said this, Wal Mayaba, one of the great scholars of hadith, said that he thought they were the policemen that cruelly beated people, like police brutality, that those people would be for the fire, because they have state authority to do what they're doing, which makes it even worse. You can't really defend yourself against them. And then the other is the women who are naked and dressed at the same time. And some of the ulama, they didn't know what that meant. I mean, some of them said it means kasiyatun fid dunya, ariyatun fil akhirah. They interpreted it to mean metaphysically. Some of them said it meant that they were dressed in this world but naked in the next world. But that's everybody. Now it's, I think, very obvious for people what that hadith means. And it's one of the mu'jizat of the Prophet ﷺ. And he said that their hair would be like disheveled Bactrian camels. That's the camel from like Afghanistan and Persia that has wild hair. Because traditionally people wore their hair back. Even cultures that didn't cover their head, women did not do this, thing that you can do with hairspray and all that stuff, right? And also the Prophet ﷺ said, he said, "Kullu aynin tizni," every eye fornicates. So that's a sign that it is a type of that happens. And he said, so if a woman wears a strong scent and then passes a gathering of men, she is such and such, And he meant that it's like fornicating, because she's attracting them to look at her. And when they do that, they'll fornicate with their eyes. So it's almost like she's seduced them into doing something that they might not have done had she not drawn that attention to herself. So again, I mean, this is hard for modern people to understand, but this is about guarding people's hearts and keeping people spiritually healthy so that they don't end up being like animals. And then also, for that reason, a woman is prohibited from allowing a man with whom she could legally marry, even if hypothetically. In other words, if she's married to the brother when she's married to the husband, even if it's something that one wouldn't think about, like marrying the brother, because most women wouldn't think about that as a stranger because he's part of the family. But even if it's can happen after the divorce, like a brother, then it's also included in the prohibition. So a woman should not allow a stranger into her house, even if it's her husband's brother, which is the hamu, for that reason, because it can also lead to things that are inappropriate.
This completes CD number 6. This begins CD number 7.
I just wanted to say that the Quran that we're looking at all have a relationship to the subject. And the thing about the Quran is sometimes you don't see the relationship. And that's what takes what's called tadabbur, which is to reflect deeply about something. Because the Quran says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Don't they penetrate this Quran to its depth, penetrate it. Dubar is the end of something. So you try to, yatadabbar is to attempt to find the end. So don't you attempt to find, you're never going to get to the end because it's karam Allah. But the yatadabbur is to really reflect, to try to get to the other side. So it's all related. And one of the things about the Quran, there's a miracle of Quran, which is the miracle of tarabut, which is how the Quran is unified. One of the things about most books is that there's a superficial unity to most books. But if you begin to penetrate it and get into not the context but what they call the subtext, the book begins to actually fall apart. And there's a whole school of literary criticism called deconstructionism, which is based on doing that, on deconstructing text and showing that in fact that there's not a unity to the theme and things like that. And the thing about the Quran is at the superficial level, it seems very ununified. It doesn't seem to have a theme that's holding it together. But as you begin to attempt to deconstruct or dive into it, what you see is that it's actually completely connected. And the analogy my favorite analogy for that is the stars. If you look up at the stars and have never looked at the night sky, it looks like it's a jumble of lights that has no connection. But if you begin to observe it every day, and you can't do it for one lifetime, it's taken millennia to even understand what we know today. And even what we know today is like somebody who threw a net out into the ocean and he pulls in all the fish and he determines that's what's in the ocean based on the size of his net. So human knowledge, what we know is like throwing a net into the ocean of knowledge, and we've pulled in a certain amount, but it's only what our net contains. And there's different people have different intellectual capacity. The Quran mentions about sarat al-awdiyatun biqadriha, that when Allah revealed the water, it flowed in the valleys according to the measurement of the valley. And Ibn Abbas said it means that when Allah sent down the Quran, every human being will get a different amount of understanding from the Quran, like that valley in which the water flows. Some valleys can take a lot of water and other valleys can't take very much. And human beings are like that. And there's a hikmah, there's a wisdom in that. So one of the things of this connection between the Quran is the connection between a chapter and then the chapter that follows it. And Ali Imran is what precedes An-Nisa. And of all the women, the highest woman, the one that was chosen above women, was the mother of Mary, alayha salam. And there's a strong opinion of many scholars, including Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, that she was actually from the Nabiyyin, that she actually received revelation. It's a strong opinion. The majority, Jamhur al-Ulama, the majority of scholars say that the prophets are from male only. But there's a strong opinion. It's not a weak opinion. It's not. And Ibn Hazm and others were absolutely convinced of that. So Ali Imran ends, you see, the Maryam is the fruit of Ali Imran, which is that prophetic line. And so the prophetic line of Bani Israel ends with a woman, because she is the one that gives birth to Isa, who doesn't have a father. So he's actually comes through the prophetic line through a woman, which is interesting also from the Prophet ﷺ's family, which is through Fatima ﷺ. So you have a similar, the beginning of the prophetic offspring of the Prophet ﷺ. In other words, the prophetic line is through Fatima and not through a son. So Ali Imran is followed by An-Nisa. Now if you look, last week we looked at the beginning, which is all about taqwa and having awareness of your kinship bonds that are from the womb. And the womb is what? Woman, from one cognate, it's the man who has a womb. Because traditionally, Mensch in German, which is where we get men or man from, was a noun that applied to both male and female. It didn't have a gender-specific meaning. And so woman is also a Mensch, a man. So and this is what insan is. Insan applies to both male and female. And then you get dhakar and untha are the two that come out of that, the male and the female. So if you look at the end of Al-Imran, which the end of chapters often are deeply related, in fact, according to Ibn Zubayr, always related to the beginnings of the next chapter. There's a thematic relationship between one that preceded and one that follows. If you look at the end of Ali Imran, in which this verse is the 200th verse of this chapter, and it is Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu isbiru wa sabiru wa rabitu wattaqullaha la'allakum tuflihun. It's, O you who believe, isbiru, have sabr, patience, wa sabiru, and have musabara. Both of these words, isbiru wa sabiru, are from sabara, yasbiru. And the root of this word, sabara, is to be patient or to bear something, because that's what patience is. Patience is bearing something and accepting it. And the command here is to be patient. If you believe, isbiru wa sabru. Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu isbiru wa sabiru. Have patience and have musabara. Musabara is patience with others. So the first is have patience with yourself, and then the second is have patience with others. Because all relationships in the world are only of two kinds: relationships with yourself and relationships with others. That's it. Now, the idea of a relationship between yourself and between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's two ways you can look at that. One of them is that in reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was and nothing was with Him, and He continues to remain as He was. In other words, your contingent existence in relationship to Allah is cancelled out. Right? And that's one of the meanings of La ilaha illallah. That there's no reality except Allah. Which is not to say this is Allah. It's to say that this is really, it's not real. Because Allah is the only haqq. But He created this with the haqq. So what that means is it has contingent reality. So we're not like Hindus that say that this is an illusion, although there is an illusory aspect to the world. There's an element in the world that is, it's an illusion. And we know that now. I mean, you can go into, they can put you in a virtual game now, and you'll think that what's happening to you is happening. In other words, you can be, they'll fly you up in a plane, or you can be on a racetrack driving in a car, and your emotions, your adrenals, and all of your emotions are going to be the same as if it was this. Right? That's an analogy, in a sense, for what's happening here. Because in the end, most of what's happening, they're mental formations that we set up in our mind. And you can get so caught up in that you lose sight that it's a virtual reality. That this is a type of virtual reality. But it does have reality in that it exists by Allah. It's contingently existent. And so your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a real one. It's not unreal, nor is it an illusion. But your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has both elements. In other words, it has the aspect of sabr and musabara. It has both elements. So this is in relation to how we are in the world. All right? And in the world, it's ultimately going to be you and those things that Allah has given you taklif to do. And then you and those people that you're going to interact with. Concerning those things with which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, isbiru, the first and foremost is knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That coming to know Allah is a process. You don't get an illumination. There's a process of coming to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It begins with infancy, and as you move on and get older, it continues. So initially, a child, when it comes into the world, it's in this state of unity. It hasn't differentiated yet. And then it begins to move into differentiation. And during that process, the parents are entrusted with giving that child guidance. In other words, making the experience of coming into the world of differentiation meaningful and reminding them of where they came from. You have to remind the child where they came from. So that becomes an obligation. So the process of coming to know Allah is taklif. It's actually, we are responsible. فَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Know that there is nothing worthy of worship except Allah. So that's a taklif that Allah has given you. And you have to be patient with that process. All right? And there's degrees of that, of knowledge of Allah. The people that know, the Prophet said, أَنَا أَخْشَاكُمْ لِلَّهِ. I have more awe of Allah than any of you. And the reason for that is because أَنَا أَعْلَمُكُمْ بِاللَّهِ. I know Allah better than any of you. وَإِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَا. The people who have real awe are the people who know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the more you know, the more awe you obtain. And so that is sabr. Because you can increase in awareness of Allah. It's not like where you're at now is where you have to be for your entire life. In fact, it shouldn't be. There should be an increase. And you're going to go through, just like planets, they have retrograde motion. Right? In their orbit around the sun, you'll see a planet. It's not doing it in reality, but it's how we experience it. You'll see the planet moving with the rest of the stars, and then for a period of time it starts going retrograde, which in old cosmologies they thought it was a bad time. That's the way the nafs is. You can be in this orbit of divine obedience, but then you go into this retrograde motion, which is ma'asiyah. It's disobedience. And those things, there's a wisdom in that, and there's also lessons to be learned from it, but it's something that's to be struggled with. It's not something that you submit to, you struggle with it. So he says, isbiru. So that's sabr ala ma'rifah of Allah. And then the prophets, of what nubuwwah is, coming to know who the prophets were, why they came. The next is knowing adl, which is you have to learn adl. And adl has two aspects. It has justice with yourself and justice with others. But learning that is a process. You have to come to understand what justice is to the best of our ability, because we're finite. And then how to apply that towards ourselves by not oppressing, because oppression is the opposite of adl. Dhulm is the opposite of adl. And what oppression is وَضَعُ شَيْءٍ فِي غَيْرِ مَحَلِّهِ, putting something where it does not belong. If you put your limbs where they don't belong, it's called disobedience, ma'asiyah, and you have oppressed. If you take somebody's wealth and misappropriate it, you put something that does not belong to you where it does not belong, that's oppression to another. If you steal something, it's putting it where it doesn't belong, because you took it out of its place and put it in a place it didn't belong, which was your own pocket. So that is the essence of what oppression is. And learning what is halal, what is haram, and then struggling with that also. And then also the idea of ma'ad, eschatology, which is what happens after death. There's a patience in learning that, right? You have to learn what happens after life. And there's a process, and we're supposed to know that. You should know about ba'ath and resurrection, and then the hashr, the nashr, the mawqif, the hisab, the mizan, the sirat, the hawd. I mean, all these things are part of aqidah, and that's part of what Allah is saying is to come to know, is understanding those things. And then you move to the sabr of the ada al-fara'id, which is fulfilling those obligations. So you've learned the adl, and part of the adl is knowing the justice, is knowing why you were created. We can look at, in the Islamic tradition, and every system of philosophy or religion deals with 5 essential questions, and Islam deals with these essential questions. The first one is the cosmological question: where did all this come from? That's a question that Islam deals with. Where did all this come from? These are the 5 big questions. There's a lot of little questions in the world, and a lot of people spend their lives in those little questions, and they never get to the big ones. But the big ones are always confronting them, and there's only 5 basic ones. That's it. And if you learn those 5 and occupy your life with those 5, then you've done yourself a service, because they're really the only ones of worth or weight. So the first one is that cosmological question: where did this come from? And the Quran gives an answer. إِن سَأَلْتُهُمْ مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ لَيَقُولُنَّ اللَّهُ. If you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they will respond, Allah. So all of this, we believe, came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is a question of ultimate concern. Where did this come from? The next question is what they call the eschatological question, which is, how do we know anything? Right? In other words, what is knowledge, and how is knowledge obtained? And the Quran answers that question again in the beginning of the Quran. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. Read in the name of your Lord who created. خلق الإنسان من علق. اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم الإنسان بالقلم علمه ما لم يعلم. Allah is the one that taught the human being. And He also said, علمه البيان. How do we know things? We know things through language. The difference between the human and other creatures is that humans know language. Now, one of the things about language, Chomsky has what he calls the LAD, the language acquisition device, which he's saying that language is inherently programmed in the human being. In other words, it's there. Now, if you look at what a child learns in the first few years of life, by the time it's 2.5 or 3, it's speaking formulated sentences. Those sentences are much more complicated and difficult than basic mathematics. 2 + 2 = 4. To say, I want to go out and ride my bike, that is much more complicated than 2 + 2 = 4. And yet, a child of 3 can say the second and cannot say the first. It can't understand it. So where did its ability to acquire language come from? عَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانِ. He imprinted, because allama means to imprint something. And that's why the allama bil-qalam, he taught with a pen. The original pens were into clay tablets. That's why the earliest tablets that we have, the earliest writing, is clay that has these imprints. That's what the alama means. Allama means to imprint something. And so the human being has certain things imprinted in him that begin to emerge. And throughout your life, at different stages of your life, you're designed to be ready for something at certain stages. You're not ready for geometry at the age of 7. You can't understand it. I mean, there's absolute geniuses, which is, like the Arabs say, الشاذ يحفظ ولا يقاس عليه. Somebody who's unusual or out of the ordinary is taken into consideration, but not used as a standard to assess other things. So you're not ready for certain concepts. Certainly the concept of death, you cannot understand that concept in any real deep level until you begin to move into the age of tamyiz. So this idea of eschatology, with how we know things, and the Quran tells us that. And then there are 2 ways in which we know things. How we